There is a sound a mountain hollow makes in the dead of winter that you never quite forget. It isn't exactly the wind, but more like the ridge itself breathing, slow and cold, pressing its weight down on everything living below the tree line. In December of 1918, a man lies in his bed with a fever so high he is practically burning up from the inside. His wife has been awake for 2 days straight, and his children are huddled against the far wall of the cabin, watching their father slip away. Then comes the heavy sound of boots on the porch, followed by a sharp knock, and when the door finally opens, the entire atmosphere of the room shifts. The doctor has arrived. Joe Strickland is the only physician for 30 miles in any direction, and as he sets his leather bag down and rolls up his sleeves, the family finally exhales for the first time in days. He has saved people in these parts before, and nearly everyone in this hollow knows someone he pulled back from the edge of the grave. But here's the thing that no one wanted to say out loud. If he was such a healer, why did his healthiest patients keep dying the moment he stepped out the door? The Appalachian Mountains do more than just separate one town from another. They separate entirely different worlds. Back in 1918, a hollow cut deep between two ridgelines was a self-contained universe, governed by its own rules and its own sense of what was possible. The roads turned to thick mud in October and stayed that way until April, and since the county seat was a half-day ride in perfect weather, the outside world rarely made it in. In a place as isolated as this, a doctor was the closest thing to real authority most people would ever see face to face. When a child stopped breathing or a fever refused to break, there was only one name you sent for, and if that man showed up and the patient lived, he became something much more than a neighbor. Joe Strickland was that man for this valley. He wasn't trained in the fancy schools like the physicians in the big cities, but instead relied on the frontier medicine of rural Appalachia. This was a world of apprenticeships and patent tonics ordered from catalogs, where knowledge was passed between men who learned by doing rather than by reading textbooks. Strickland was considered competent and trusted because he always came when you called, and he was willing to sit with the dying while charging only what a family could actually afford to pay. Everyone understood that the medicine he practiced was imprecise, so you took the tonic and you waited to see if God or the medicine would win. His word on a person's condition was the only word that mattered because there were no second opinions or hospitals waiting down the highway. There was only Strickland and his bag, and whatever he told you was happening became the absolute truth of the matter. Underneath all that medicine and trust ran the only thing that made a life in the hollow worth living, and that was the land. These farms had been carved out of the slopes over generations of hard labor, and they passed through families in wills or handshake agreements signed at kitchen tables. A man who owned his land owned his future, but a man who lost his dirt had nothing left to leave behind, and Joe Strickland understood that better than anyone else in the mountains. The 1918 flu didn't announce itself with a roar, but rather arrived the way bad things often do in these mountain communities, moving quietly through one family and then the next, until the whole hollow was sick at once. There was no way to contain it once it started, and the isolation that usually protected these ridges suddenly felt like a trap. Nationally, the numbers were almost too big to wrap your head around, with somewhere between 50 and 100 million people dying across the globe. In the United States alone, more Americans died from that flu than in both world wars combined, creating a crisis so deep that cities ran out of coffins and Philadelphia had to dig mass graves. Health departments posted quarantine signs on front doors and prayed it would slow things down, but the sickness seemed to move faster than the warnings. In the mountains, the math was different but no less brutal, because you didn't have dense city blocks spreading infection through crowded streetcars. What you had instead were families already weakened by hard winters and poor nutrition, and they had no access to any care that a person could reasonably call modern. The flu moved from farm to farm along the same paths the neighbors used to borrow tools or share harvests, which meant there was no escaping it, and there was certainly no one coming to help, except Strickland. He was on his horse before most families had even finished sending for him, riding from farmhouse to farmhouse and ridge to ridge through the kind of cold that gets into your chest and stays there. He dispensed tonics from his bag and instructed families on keeping the sick warm and hydrated, and he always stayed long enough to assess each patient before moving on to the next one. To the people watching him work in those dim rooms, he looked like the only thing standing between their family and the cold ground. His reputation that autumn wasn't just good, it was absolute, and neighbors began to tell each other his name like it was a form of protection against the dark. Women who had watched him bring a loved one back from a high fever credited him with a kind of gift that went beyond medical knowledge into something they didn't have words for. Men who had doubted doctors their whole lives sent their children to fetch him without any hesitation, and when Strickland showed up at your door, the room filled with relief before he even opened his bag. And people did survive, and enough of them pulled through that his presence felt like the reason they were still breathing. This sense of gratitude made the anomalies easy to miss, and the first one barely registered with anyone in the community. A landowner had been improving to the point that his fever had broken, and he was taking broth, and his wife even told a neighbor he might be back on his feet within the week. Strickland paid a follow-up visit to the house, and 3 days later, the man was dead. The family accepted it because the flu was known to be like that, where you thought you were past the worst of it, and then the end came anyway. Everyone had a story like that by November of 1918, a recovery that turned without warning, or a person who seemed almost fine and then suddenly wasn't. One more death in a season full of death didn't ask for an explanation, but the pattern was already forming, even if no one could see it yet. The second death followed the same shape as the first, starting with a patient past the worst of it, who suffered a sudden collapse after a follow-up visit. The third followed the same shape as the second, and by the time winter settled fully into the hollow, Strickland had lost several patients who had been getting better. These people weren't just holding steady or recovering slowly, they were actually improving with their color coming back and their appetites returning. And then Strickland came back to check on them, and within a few days, they were gone. Taken individually, each death made a kind of terrible sense, because the flu had a reputation for these exact kinds of false recoveries. Doctors everywhere were watching patients improve, and then die suddenly when their lungs filled up for good, which was one of the disease's cruelest features that everyone in 1918 knew about. So when a family in the hollow watched a sick relative worsen after Strickland's second visit, they simply grieved and buried their dead while thanking the doctor for coming at all. What nobody was tracking, because nobody had a reason to, was exactly who was dying. It wasn't the very old or the very young, or the ones who had been bedridden since October, but rather the landowners who held title to property with clear boundaries and recorded deeds. These were the men and widows who had no obvious heirs waiting to contest anything, and their farms sat on good bottomland or had valuable timber on them. Plots along the creek where the soil was deep enough to be worth something were the ones that belonged to the patients who got worse. And after they died, the wills appeared. Not every family had a will prepared in advance, because the lawyer nearest to the hollow required a full day of travel to reach. Written estate documents were common enough but not universal, yet in the weeks after these particular deaths, documents started showing up that had been signed in the final days of illness. These pages redirected property away from the expected heirs and toward Strickland, or toward men connected to him in ways the community didn't immediately see. The forgery didn't require sophistication, it only required opportunity and a community that wasn't looking for a predator in their midst. A dying man's mark on a page with a neighbor standing witness who couldn't read what he was witnessing was legally sufficient for the courts. The witnesses weren't lying when they confirmed they had been present and watched someone make a mark, but they had no idea what the document actually said. Strickland was the one who read it to them and explained what the sick man had decided, and because he was the doctor and the trusted one, they simply nodded and signed their own names to a document they had never seen clearly. County records don't ask questions when a deed gets filed or a title transfers from one name to another. A parcel that belonged to one family for generations now belonged to someone else, and the clerk in the county seat processed it the same way he processed everything else that came across his desk. The hollow absorbed each transfer as ordinary grief, because land always changed hands when people died. That was how it worked, and that had always been how it worked. And nobody counted how many times it was happening, or noticed whose name kept appearing on the receiving end. It wasn't a lawyer who first spoke up, and it wasn't a sheriff or a preacher or anyone with the kind of standing that makes an accusation stick. The first person to say something was just a woman who had been in the room. She had watched her father sign the document from about 6 feet away while Strickland read the words aloud to him, and she saw her father make his mark before the neighbor witness pressed his own name to the page. She knew her father better than anyone else did. She knew what he had always said about the land and who he intended to leave it to, because he had told her and her brothers the same thing every time the subject came up over 20 years of suppers. What Strickland read aloud that day didn't match a single word of it. She waited until the burial was over, and then she started asking questions. The first person she talked to told her she was just grieving wrong, while the second person said she didn't understand how sickness changes a man's thinking. They told her it wasn't unheard of for a person near death to want to settle things differently than he had originally planned. But the third person simply told her to let it go in a way that felt more like a warning than comfort. This is what happens when you accuse the only doctor in a community that depends on him to stay alive. The accusation doesn't land on Strickland, it lands on you. You become the unstable one, the grieving daughter who can't accept a loss, or the person making trouble during a season when everyone has lost someone and nobody has the energy for a fight. Strickland was still riding out to the farmhouses to sit with the sick, and he was still showing up whenever a family sent for him. To the people watching him work, the accusation made no sense at all. This man had been inside their homes and held their children through the worst nights of their lives. You didn't accuse a man like that based on the daughter's memory of a document she had never even held in her hands. Local officials heard the complaint and decided not to move on it. Whether that was because of indifference or incompetence or something closer to a private arrangement isn't fully clear, but the result was exactly the same. The question got filed away or talked down until it was simply not pursued anymore. Strickland was never called in to answer a single question. The will stood, and the land transferred. Then, while that first complaint was still sitting unanswered, another patient died. It followed the same shape as all the others. A landowner had a recovery that seemed real, followed by a visit from the doctor and a rapid decline. This family hadn't heard the first woman's question, or if they had, they'd heard it filtered through the same dismissal everyone else used. They mourned their loss and accepted it as the flu. The will that followed redirected a choice parcel of bottomland to a man who had no previous connection to the family at all. By this point, the woman who started asking questions had told her story to enough people that a few of them were finally listening. They weren't acting yet, but they were listening and holding her story against what they had seen in their own families. They started comparing notes in the way that hollow communities always do, which is quietly and in the margins of other conversations. The shape of what she was describing had started to fit things other people had noticed but never dared to name. The problem was that noticing something and being willing to say it out loud in front of witnesses were two entirely different things. You had to be willing to stand against a man the whole community still needed. Strickland understood that gap better than anyone. When someone finally held those documents side by side, the first thing they noticed wasn't the words on the page. It was the handwriting. A man who has spent his adult life farming has hands shaped by axe handles and plow grips, with knuckles that have been broken and reset more times than he can count. He doesn't produce the same signature at the end of his life that he produced at the start of it. Age changes the way a man writes, and illness changes it even faster. What you would expect from a man dying of the flu in his third week of sickness is something shaky and barely legible. What showed up on several of these documents was a careful mark that was controlled and consistent with a hand that wasn't struggling at all. In at least 2 cases, men who were barely conscious in their final days had apparently signed their names with more steadiness than they had managed when they were healthy. The witnesses were the second problem, but not because they had lied to anyone. Their role in the process had been largely ceremonial, because you don't actually need to understand a document to witness a signature. You just need to be present and confirm that you saw the pen hit the paper. Several of the witnesses on these wills were men and women who couldn't read at all. They had been in the room and watched Strickland guide a sick man's hand to the page, and then they added their own marks when they were asked to do so. None of that was a lie, but it didn't mean they had any idea what the page actually said. Strickland had been the one reading it to them. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. In a community without a strong notary culture, the witness's only job was to verify that people were in the room. The legal weight fell on the document itself and the physical record it created. Once that record was filed at the county courthouse, it became the official truth. Whatever had actually been said or intended in that sick room didn't matter, because the filed deed was the only thing the law recognized. Title transferred, property changed hands, and the courthouse never followed up. When someone finally traced the land records carefully, they saw a concentration of wealth that didn't happen by accident. Properties that had been in the same families for 3 generations were changing hands in a very tight window of time. These transfers clustered around the end of 1918 and the start of 1919, which was the exact peak of Strickland's patient list. The names on the receiving end of those transfers kept repeating. Sometimes it was Strickland directly, and other times it was men who owed him money or worked alongside him in ways the Hollow hadn't examined closely enough. This is what separates what Strickland was doing from simple opportunism. An opportunist waits for circumstances to create an opening, but the records suggested he was practicing selection. The patients who died after his follow-up visits weren't random, and they weren't just the sickest ones. They were the ones with something worth taking. He looked for the farms with clear deeds and the widows sitting on timber acreage with no sons old enough to fight a will. He targeted the older landowners whose heirs were scattered or too overwhelmed by grief to look at a document in the days after a burial. The flu made this possible in a way that no other tragedy could have. In an ordinary year, a cluster of deaths among landowners following the doctor's visits would have stood out immediately. People would have talked sooner and reached the obvious question before the transfers were even complete. But in a pandemic, the cause of death was never in question. Nobody demanded an explanation or an examination. The body needed to be moved quickly to protect the family from exposure, and the paperwork that followed was just the administrative tale of a grief that had already been accepted. Strickland understood the timeline better than the families did. He knew exactly how long the shock would last, and when people were too deep in mourning to read the fine print. He filed the papers while they weren't looking. The silence that had settled over the Hollow finally broke from the outside. It started with a man who was related to one of the families but lived far enough away that he didn't know Strickland a thing. For months, he had been listening to the same disturbing story from 2 different relatives, and he simply could not make their accounts match the land records he found at the courthouse. He wasn't a lawyer or some high-level investigator, but he had enough distance from the community to look at those documents without needing them to say anything other than the cold truth. What those papers revealed was a specific pattern where deaths led to a concentration of property transfers, and the same name kept appearing at the center of every single one. He decided to take what he found to a county official who had no prior connection to Strickland. This was the most important part of the entire story, because it wasn't just about what he brought, but who he chose to show it to. Every earlier attempt to raise an alarm had run straight into a wall of local entanglement, which is how a small community often folds its institutions around the people it has decided to trust. If he had gone to a different official, someone who had sat across from Strickland at church or owed him a favor for helping a sick child, the result would have been the same quiet dismissal the woman had received months earlier. This man didn't do that. When investigators finally pulled the full record, what they found wasn't actually that complicated, but it was more information than anyone had ever tried to assemble in one place before. They looked at death dates, will filing dates, deed transfers, and the names of every witness involved. When they laid it all out in a sequence, without the grief and the noise of the pandemic clouding the view, the timeline read exactly like a ledger. A patient improves, the doctor visits, the patient dies, a will suddenly surfaces, and the land transfers. It happened again and again and again, spread across a time when the whole hollow had been too sick and too frightened to step back and count the bodies. They began interviewing the witnesses, and most of them confirmed the exact same thing the first woman had described to the authorities. They had been present in the room and watched marks get made on paper, but they hadn't understood the documents because no one had actually shown them the text. Strickland had only read parts of it aloud to them. A few of these witnesses admitted they hadn't been certain the sick man even knew what he was agreeing to at the time. They had simply assumed Strickland was handling everything properly because Strickland had handled everything for the community for years. That had been the operating assumption for a long time, and it was only now, when they were asked to say out loud what they had actually seen, that the assumption started to feel like something that had been forced on them. Strickland did not collapse when the pressure finally came down on him. He disputed every single allegation with the steadiness of a man who had spent his entire adult life being believed without question. He had an explanation for every will, every suspicious bit of timing, and every acre of land he had acquired. He claimed the patients had asked him to help put their affairs in order, and he had only done what they requested of him. The property arrangements were just compensation, or gifts, or the final dying wishes of men who had trusted him more than they trusted their own blood. He said all of this with a calm voice, and back in the hollow, some people chose to keep believing him. The community split in a way that these mountain hollows rarely ever recover from. There were families who had watched him sit with their dying loved ones, and they could not make the accusation fit the man they thought they knew. There were other families who had watched the exact same scenes play out, and they understood, only now, what they had actually been witnessing. The legal outcome was incomplete in the way that justice in these rural settings often tends to be. Charges were only pursued on the clearest cases where the documentary evidence was tight enough to hold up in a courtroom. Some of the land transfers were eventually reversed, but many of them were not. The properties that had changed hands the cleanest, where the paperwork had been filed the longest and the witnesses had already scattered, stayed exactly where they were. You have to ask yourself why you have never heard this man's name before now. It isn't because the story is obscure in the way that minor historical footnotes are usually buried in some academic journal. This story is hidden because the very conditions that made the crime possible are the same conditions that erased it from our memory afterward. You have to start with the press and how information moved back then. A hollow in 1918 didn't have its own newspaper, and the nearest paper was in a county seat that mostly covered courthouse news, crop prices, and the occasional violent crime if it was flashy enough. A pattern of suspicious deaths among farming families, spread out across a flu season without bodies or a dramatic arrest, just wasn't a story any editor was going to assign to a reporter. It was nothing more than background noise, and background noise doesn't get archived or indexed for the future. It doesn't turn up when a researcher in 1970 or 1990 goes looking for documented cases of serial killers. The university system that might have produced a historian interested in this kind of case had no institutional reason to ever look in this direction. Rural Appalachian crime from the early 20th century is not exactly a well-funded research category for academics. The families who were affected by these crimes weren't prominent people, and the property involved was modest by any standard outside the hollow itself. There were no famous names attached to the case, and no political dimension that would have drawn outside scrutiny or crossed the threshold from a local tragedy into something the wider culture decided to preserve. Then you have to consider the community itself and the specific work that shame does on a person's memory. When a hollow spends years believing in a man, and when families have told each other stories about how he saved a mother or pulled a child through a winter, the discovery that he was also a killer doesn't produce a clean reckoning. It produces a heavy silence. It isn't the silence of people who don't know what happened, but the silence of people who know the truth and don't know how to hold both things at once. They can't reconcile the real help and the real harm that came from the same hands in the same years. That kind of silence never gets written down, but it gets passed through families as a reluctance to talk about certain names or certain farms that changed hands when they shouldn't have. The flu itself did the rest of the work. 50 million deaths worldwide means that every individual story inside that massive number requires an active effort to preserve it. The mass event always swallows the specific cases, and Strickland's victims died in a year when dying was ordinary and causes were rarely examined. Speed and volume overtook documentation in 1918. Whatever records might have survived the investigation were folded into the broader administrative wreckage of a pandemic year when county offices were understaffed and nobody was cataloging anything with care. What remains today is just the shape of what happened, and it is only visible in the land records if you know exactly what you are looking for. You can still hear it in family accounts if you are in the right hollow and you know how to ask the right questions. It isn't a case file with a tidy ending or a trial transcript sitting in a state archive. It is just the outline of a pattern in documents that were never meant to tell this story, kept alive by the memory of people who have been carrying the weight of it for a century. Some hollows keep their history in stone markers, but this one remembers through what is missing. You can see it in the farms that went quiet and the family names that vanished from the county records after 1919, leaving behind land that passed to strangers and never returned to the people who cleared it. The oral history still moves in fragments through these hills, showing up when older relatives lower their voices at the mention of certain surnames. You might notice it in the way a specific stretch of bottomland carries a heavy reputation that nobody ever feels the need to explain clearly to an outsider. Strickland was never an outsider who came here to prey on a vulnerable community because he was already part of the foundation. That belonging is exactly what made his crimes possible, and it is the reason why the memory of him is so difficult to wash away. The most dangerous man in an isolated place is rarely the one who arrives with bad intentions. Usually, it is the man who shows up when you are desperate and stays until you cannot imagine the world without him. While the flu killed thousands in these mountains, Strickland used every one of those deaths as a convenient cover for his own work. You should subscribe for